The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Dave?
Hi. Hello. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining the webinar today. This is a very short introduction to open the event and to welcome you all. I believe we have over 400 attendees, 300 from Australia, 100 from New Zealand, and also attendees from the UK, of course. I don't think you often experience that in transport modelling, so we must be doing something right. A quick recognition of AITPM's support and NZMUG's support and the coordination of Landor Links UK, all of which we couldn't have done without, that's for sure. Last but not least, some recognition and sincere thanks to all the presenters, the organisers, moderators and contributors for this valuable forum. And I'll hand over to the beginning of the event with the presenters. Thanks everybody for joining.
This is where I quickly step in, Tom van Vuren. I'm chairing today's webinar. Welcome. We've got a rather grand title, Future Strategies for Utilizing Mobile Phone or Big Data in Transport Modeling. Now, for me, what this webinar is really about is looking at the current approaches and successes. And I hope that we can pick up the future strategies in the Q&A session afterwards and in the subsequent online discussions, details of which you will find in the last few slides today. I've worked with mobile phone data providers and their data for about 5 years. And this webinar brings together people that I've worked with in this space, from government and clients and their consultants in the UK and elsewhere in Europe. And what I really would like to achieve is two things. One is for them to outline why using this kind of big data has been beneficial to them, and also to outline how their data providers and consultants have made this happen. My personal position is that mobile phone data is a data source that we cannot ignore. It has got its challenges, but the speakers today all have spent many years learning and improving their data sets and processes, turning mobile phone traces into useful, valuable data in transport planning. And here in Australia and New Zealand, we can piggyback on that, speeding up this kind of delivery at a lower cost whilst protecting credibility and analytical robustness. As a chairman, I need to give you a few pointers to make this a success. So you have joined the presentation listening, probably using your computer speaker system. If you would prefer to join over the phone, you would need to select telephone in the audio pane, and then appropriate dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing in your questions in the questions pane in the control panel. And you can do this at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentations. And the ones that we can't handle, we will take forward into a discussion site that will stay open for about a month following the webinar. You need to be aware that today's webinar is being recorded. So I want to now introduce the four presentations that we've got. First up is Claire Cherian from Transport for London, describing her experiences why TfL use mobile phone data and transport planning and modeling, and the benefits and challenges she has encountered, the realities of working with such big data, and the next steps that TfL foresees in using it. And she's supported by Tim Beach from Jacobs. Then we've got 3 more technical presentations on how mobile data are collected and processed by the mobile network operators. In other words, how is the data that you and I C generated and what should we know about that by Philippe Perret from CityLogic. Then we get a presentation on the work done by the Department for Transport on benchmarking mobile phone data, as it were the quality assurance of the inputs to our models and the processes that have been put in place to generate model matrices. And this will be presented by Neela Sari from the department and Reza Toloui from ACOM. And finally, then we have got a presentation by Louis Williamson representing Kineo Analytics about how we can add value to mobile phone data by merging it with other big data sets. I expect that this will take just under an hour, which leaves us about half an hour for the Q&A session, which I really am looking forward to. So don't forget to submit your questions during the presentations. Claire, can I hand it over to you?
Hi, thanks very much. Yeah, so as you said, this is a bit of a joint presentation between myself, Claire Cherian from Transport for London, and Tim Beach from Jacobs, just split into two halves really. So yeah, if we crack onto the first slide, Tim, who's in control, because I'm not. So just wanted to kind of really open with some of the opportunities for using mobile network data in transport planning and modelling. I mean, there's several ways that we have explored within our organisation, including both short and long-term monitoring and evaluation, understanding how the city is changing over time, or even just on kind of shorter bursts, like say major event days. But the main focus of what we'll talk about in our overview is really based on the construction of matrices for transport modelling. And this is offering us very in-depth insights into movement of people, but also broken down by mode and by purpose. This also comes alongside getting wider insights. We're starting to see we can get a huge kind of temporal range in the data. So we can start to look at things that are important to large urban areas, like the nighttime economy, and also understanding how people from outside of our city are influencing the flows of traffic, say on the outer edges. So if we just go on to look at some of the challenges and opportunities. So we just want to kind of connect through some of the ideas on this slide. So there's some clear benefits, but then they present their own challenges. And then once you kind of get stuck into projects like this, some realities become clear. So one of the main benefits is obviously that we're working with a huge number of data points, working with really big data sets. And we're also removing the human element of data collection. Typically, these model matrices would have been constructed with roadside interviews in London. And that's fast becoming kind of not an accepted way of going about our data collection, particularly on our congested road networks. So there's a great opportunity here. But we need to understand this data. We need to understand its shortcomings, its biases. You know, obviously, many of us will be aware that you will be lacking in short distance trips. And we're also in this world of base matrix construction, not just interested in relative change. We want to understand the whole population. So expansion is a really key factor here, not just the population of our city, but the whole population of the people traveling into our city. So whilst we've taken out the human element of data collection, the reality is that there's a huge intensive exercise, both in terms of people and computer power, in order to deal with this data. So you've kind of replaced one human element challenge with another kind of human and tech challenge there. And it also hasn't removed entirely the need for survey data. So maybe not roadside-based survey, but our project in London did rely heavily on our household survey for validation and for incorporation in some of the methods. As I mentioned before, you know, there's obviously parts of the data that aren't, there's certain aspects that are missing, and you will look to complementary data sources. But again, you need to understand these data sources themselves, understand their own biases. And actually, in our own experience, a lot of the data sets we thought we might use didn't actually feature as heavily in the end as expected at the beginning, just because they weren't necessarily adding as much value. So that's the kind of data opportunity challenge side. There's obviously, for us as local authorities, the potential for large cost reductions and kind of efficiency that comes from using mobile data, because we can start to get additional analytical insights. This is one of the major kind of tangible benefits there, kind of beyond the kind of technical transport planning side. But we had to be incredibly careful about privacy. We are dealing with huge amounts of essentially people's data, and it was very clear that we therefore would never kind of be able to see the individual data points, and we would only ever be working with aggregated and anonymized data, as should be the case. So setting up a project like this with privacy in mind from the beginning and being open and honest about how you're using that data is incredibly important, we found on this project. Another benefit that we thought about going down this route of using mobile network data is that we would start to be able to do a kind of rolling update program. We'd set the method up, and then maybe a few years down the line, we would redo the process. But the reality of that, again, is that technology is changing so quickly, and actually you would want to do things differently each time. Maybe you'd want to bring in other new data sources. And so in a way, it's not giving you this easy button pushing update mechanism that maybe we'd considered it could do at the start. So I'm just going to hand over to Tim now, who's going to talk a bit about the kind of big next step that this is opportunity this is given, but also thinking about some of the next steps in this field.
Thanks, Claire. So firstly, what I wanted to highlight and bring to the fore is really clarify some of the numbers that Claire was really talking about, just to identify how big this data is and what we can start to think about using this data for. So what I'm presenting on the slide here is the traditional method in which TfL used to collect data and develop their demand matrices from, which was from their travel demand survey, so a household diary, and that was traditionally collected over a one-day period based on a travel diary. And as part of this previous study, we were able to start collecting this over 3-month period, so that we're starting to be able to see that temporal nature. How do patterns change over time? Is there such thing as an average weekday, which we typically use? In terms of just the sheer volume of data, that household interview, because of the sheer cost of doing those traditional survey methods, we were only able to collect, historically, or TfL were only able to collect around 18,000 people within that survey. Using mobile network data, this massively expanded to over 15 million people that we were able to see over the 3-month period, which equated to almost 400 million trips over that time period. Another consequence of using mobile network data was looking into tourists, and London is one of the largest tourist hotspots on the planet, and over the year they'll get many million tourists coming into it, and traditionally that was a very difficult source of data to collect and wouldn't typically be used within most transport modeling exercises. With using mobile network data, this is a new thing that we were able to collect. So where historically they weren't able to see these, we were able to look at over 3 million tourist trips over the study period that we were collecting. So a huge step forward in what we were looking at in terms of the size of the data, but also the nature of the data itself that we were looking at. So as we move forward, from what we've learned so far, and this will be picked up by some of my colleagues later on, where do we want to take this, or what are the challenges that we saw as part of the projects that we've done that we may wish to observe in the future? So the first one that we want to pick up on is looking at using counts that we typically compare our transport models against. And within using mobile network data at present, we're not using these in the development of our transport models, only in the comparison to see how they fit once we assign them to a transport network. And this is at odds with how historically using the likes of roadside interviews or public transport intercept surveys. So what we may see, and what we have seen, is that when we actually come to assign mobile network matrices, there can be quite a disconnect between what we see within the mobile network data and what we are actually seeing on the ground. And I think there may be something that we would like to move forward with, and how we incorporate those sorts of observations within the mobile network data, and something we can pick up later. The second thing, and this is what Claire was picking up on, is that this is a moving beast. Mobile network data is a new technology that that's matured over the last 5 to 10 years, but there are new technologies that are coming online. So these are things like app-based data within smartphones, location-based services. As cars become much more connected, there'll be a lot more sensors and information that they can pass their locations. So there's a lot more data sources that are coming to the fore that could come into this space. And do we start to incorporate these within our transport planning and travel demand matrices? So it's an exciting new area that we may wish to move into. Another area that could really sort of take huge steps forwards is in the real-time or near real-time operational purposes. So as we start to collect mobile network data and other data sources, can we collect them at a real-time basis so that we can actually have operational impacts and see what are very near-term predictions that we can help with our congestion problems within our major cities? And the final point on this is, because we're starting to develop much more temporal nature and a larger sample of data, can we start to develop population synthesizers as we need to potentially move into mobility as a service, and start to see how people are moving throughout a day, and develop tools that could feed into agent-based modeling from the likes of mobile network data. So those are 4 sort of areas that I think might be useful for some conversation and questions later on. So I'll pass that over, but those are the main points that we would like to raise on our presentation.
Okay, thanks, Claire and Tim. Philippe, will you take this further?
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Philippe Perret, and I work for CityLogit. And our primary focus is actually to process mobile phone data, which we then pass on to engineering consultancies, who then develop their transport model with the data. So what I would like to do today is first to give you a brief introduction in terms of the technology itself, so that then it can explain how we process the data resulting from the abilities that the technology have. Basically, mobile phone data, when we refer to this, is basically data collected through monitoring technical messages existing within the 2G, 3G, 4G networks. And it's basically helping us to locate a probe or mobile device accurately within a cell. So a cell is basically a mast on the antenna, which is pointing in a specific direction. The size of the cells can vary. The higher the G, the smaller the coverage tends to be. Also, the very important thing is that when the data is collected for each individual device behind our firewall, which is given a random identifier, so that we can follow a device over a long period of time. But also, what's very important is that cellular data can be categorized in 2 forms, which is what we call on-call and off-call. And I'll go back to this in a minute. But also what's important to realize is that it's also slightly different from CDR, which is call data records. And we go way beyond this data using now mobile data. So first, if we discuss the type of connections we have what we tend to call the passive connections. The passive connections are connections where the user of the device is actually not active with their phone, so they are not on a call or browsing or anything. This kind of data set, the off-call, are not generating a lot of events. They would generate events at regular periods, maybe every 2 hours, letting the network know where the device is, or as a device travel, when it goes through groups of cells which are connected together to help mobile operators understanding where devices are as they travel. The important element in terms of the passive connections or off-call is that this may not be very spatially granular because we don't go to the level of exact cell, but group of cells only. However, this is an extremely large sample. And what we mean by this is that basically all devices, if they are on, will provide us with that data. Then we've got a secondary set, which is what we call the on-call or active connections. This is actually when users are using their phones, so making calls or browsing on the internet, or even apps just pushing information. This generates a lot of events. What we are talking about here might be hundreds of events a minute, which are very granular because at that time, mobile operators are really directing the information to the exact cell where the device is. However, what we have here is a far more limited sample because you are not, or users, mobile device users, are not active on their devices all the time. And you will find that probably 95% of the time, your device is in an off-call mode, generating only passive connections, and only 5% of the times it is generating active connections. But what's very important here is for us to be able to really understand movement is really how many events tend to be generated using this information. Typically, a device would generate around 250 to 300 events a day in their useful form. So when we remove the 100 events per minute, which are not really useful for us, only keep 1 or 2 events per minute, we have about 250 events per day per device, which we can analyze. But also what becomes very interesting is when we start looking at how events are recorded, considering the device behavior. What we find is when devices are traveling with their owners, we have more events being collected, which is very much critical from our perspective, as the purpose of the analysis we do is to understand movement. That's a kind of resultant traces we can obtain for a device. On the left-hand side, we've presented it with points, and we can really see how someone has traveled. Here we are talking about an area south of London, so traveling from Gatwick Airport to the heart of central London, then moving east towards the M25, the big London ring road, and then traveling on the ring road on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, we actually see a device traveling from East London towards central London on west areas of London. What's very interesting with the picture on the right is that you actually see on that picture the cell size. And this is where some of the limitations around mobile phone data tend to come. This is that the data itself does not give us an accurate location in terms of what GPS could give us. What we get is an area where a device tends to be. And this is very important when we start to look at the limitations around mobile phone data. Now that we have the technology, we can then start thinking about how the data is actually being used. And we analyzed both on-call and off-call events. And after the data is processed, we've actually, mobile operators have created series of algorithms which help to identify the trip starts in terms of cell on time, on trip ends in terms of cell on time, and also what we call dwells, which is the period when a device is not moving. This is done through a series of thresholds being used. Typically around 30 minutes is assumed to be the duration after which we can consider a device isn't moving. We can also then start to identify the mode by looking at the traces, looking at the speed of the traces, and doing pattern recollections against predefined cell movements, for example, cell movements following rail routes. And that might allow us to separate rail trips from road-based trips, for example. But also, as Tim and Claire mentioned, one of the powerful tools within mobile phone data is that we can do long-term analysis on a device. And that allows us to define key points of interest. Would it be a point visited on a regular basis at nighttime, which is very much akin to the home, points regularly visited over daytimes, which are most likely to be related to work. And that allows us to then identify purpose of travel within a limited range. And I think we've got to be very clear about this. So the kind of trips we can really identify, trip purposes would include, for example, commuting trips or home-based other trips or non-home base. We can also do some analysis in terms of routing, but the critical information at the moment behind the firewalls of the mobile operator is stored at cell level. And this is where one of the very complex parts start to come, which is that cell mapping typically is seen as very sensitive by mobile network operators, because actually this is what helps them secure business with consumers and other people. But the important thing to understand with cell size is that they vary quite greatly, and they do not have exact boundaries. Actually, just the weather means that a 2G cell, which normally covers about 750 meters, might, if it starts raining, cover 900 meters. So this is an important element, and again, an important limitation of mobile phone data. A good thing, though, about how the cell plans are covered by mobile operators is that they tend to put cells where there is demand, which means that in urban areas, we can achieve better resolution than in rural areas. And again, from a transport planning perspective, this is pretty much what we are interested in. And then the MNOs develop their cell to zones, and typically the kind of zoning we've been using in the UK is about data collected at census level, which is medium super output areas. These cover roughly 6,000 inhabitants. And why do we use census in boundaries? Is because we need this kind of information to undertake our expansion. The critical element here is that we are only following devices. We are not following people. But we need to understand how many people might a device represent. And when we deal with this, we have to deal with two things. We have to deal with the market share, and we've got to deal with the mobile phone penetration. Market share is the split between the various mobile network operators in a specific location, whilst mobile phone penetration is the average number of devices people tend to carry with them. And this is undertaken typically using the home information, which is being derived from mobile phone data, and comparing it with the census population in an area. That gives us a ratio given for each device, and that ratio is actually carried through the entire trip chain of that device. Thank you. I think it's now time for my colleague to take over.
Thanks, Philippe. Can somebody progress the slides, please?
Okay, good morning everyone in the United Kingdom and good afternoon or evening for colleagues in the Southern Hemisphere. My name is Nila Sari and I'm a transport modeler. I work for the Department for Transport in the United Kingdom. I'm going to talk briefly about the emerging guidance on developing demand matrices, and Reza Toloi from ACOM will talk in a bit more detail about the use of mobile phone data in building demand matrices. So in this slide, just a little bit of background. The Department for Transport produces and owns transport analysis guidance. In short, we call it TAG, which consists of transport modeling and appraisal methods to facilitate the development of business cases to support investment decisions. We acknowledge that there was a gap in the guidance related to demand matrix development, which has led to inconsistency in approaches with potentially poor methodology employed. So we are addressing this shortcoming by providing clear and up-to-date guidance on base year demand matrix development that reflects current best practice and the use of new data sources such as mobile network data. So the guidance is currently being reviewed and we aim to publish this guidance in November this year. I'd like to thank our consultants in ACOM and ARAP who assist us to produce this guidance. So in this next slide is just showing the front cover of the guidance and the draft structure of the contents. As you can see, it starts with an introduction and followed by an explanation of why base year demand matrices are important in the development of transport models. Then the guidance outlines the best practice to plan the process, assembling the data, and the process of matrix development itself, and then the refinement and verification of those matrices. So this slide is showing the key steps in matrix development. The first stage is about planning the development process itself. So it needs to be clear from the start what the objectives are. So questions such as what model you're building, what demand matrices you're going to need for the models. So it is important to understand the demand matrix requirements from the start. The second stage is data assembly, where data requirements are defined and data sources are identified. This stage also includes collating existing data and collecting new data. The third stage of the process is the core process of matrix development, where when you have the data, you need to look at the data errors and biases, and they need to be corrected. And at this stage, it includes combining different data sources, as mentioned previously by colleagues from Transport for London, that other data sources will be needed to support the mobile network data. So the fourth stage is the refinements of the matrices and any adjustments made that is needed in the process, and that needs to be based on evidence. An extra stage in this process, which is important, is an ongoing verification and validation of the matrices that are being built. So I'm now going to hand this over to Reza, from ACOM, who will talk about the use of mobile network data in matrix development.
Thank you, Neela, and hello, everyone. So, right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the particular challenges that transport modelers are faced with, and the processes that need to go through to basically turn this data into a matrix of demand to be used by transport models. So, in summary, the whole process could be grouped into two stages. The first stage is basically the process that is usually undertaken by mobile network operators. This is basically the process and the steps that was covered in the previous presentation by Philip, and that is mainly because development of initial matrices require access to detailed mobile network event data, so it needs to be undertaken by network operators. And then there is a second phase to this. Once these initial matrices are prepared, then the reality is that they lack some various requirements and segmentations, and they will be subject to some uncertainties and biases that should be corrected by transport modeling practitioners through some further significant processing steps. And what's quite important is that in the process, I think that has been a key factor to the success of using mobile phone data in the past few years, and that is the collaboration between transport modelers and network operators. So we need to, as transport modelers, we need to understand better the uncertainties in the data and the assumptions that has been used to process the data. On the other hand, network operators who actually deal with all the complexities of processing the raw data need to properly understand the requirements from transport modeling point of view. So I'm just going to talk about the second phase here, which it does include a number of processing steps. That is mainly composed of verification processes and also metrics development steps, where we continuously process the data, combine the data with other data sources, and also verify the outcomes. Right, so I'm just going to quickly touch on some of the main errors and biases that are in the data that needs to be addressed. So basically, errors and biases associated with processing with the process of developing demand matrices from mobile network data could be divided into three main categories. The first one is sampling error, and that relates to the sample size, and that could be, and that basically that relates to the market share of mobile network data, and that could be quantified. There are methods and statistical methods to quantify those errors. The second group of errors and biases relates to the expansion process, and that is basically because expansion factors could be affected by errors in both planning data, population data, and also by the reliability of the inferred home location of mobile phone users. And these sort of errors and biases are usually difficult to quantify. And the third group of errors and biases relates to various processing steps. So in reality, the underlying rules and assumptions used for these processes could result in errors of unknown size and characteristics. And the combined errors of these types are usually unknown and difficult to quantify. So the aim here is to both try to minimize error, but also correct biases. The distinction between the two is quite important. So I'm just going to quickly mention some of the key biases that may exist in the data that needs to be looked at and corrected. So the first one it relates to mainly the expansion process, and it is possible that the matrices are biased towards higher trip rates and longer trip distances. This is mainly relates to variation in trip rates and trip length. The fact that variation in trip rates and trip length is correlated with variation in mobile phone ownership and usage amongst certain population segments. So that is individual groups usually who tend to have more access to mobile phones, and that is irrespective of operator. They're also more likely to drive and to travel longer distances. And the key contributing factors to this correlation are age and income. In his presentation, Philip mentioned that the expansion should ideally be undertaken by income, by age groups, and that's partly to address this issue, for example. The other quite common bias could be related to allocation of trips to modes and purposes, particularly for shorter trips. These are usually inferred based on rules and implementation rules, so they could include uncertainties. The other potential bias could relate to possible misallocation of trips to zones, and that is due to limited spatial accuracy of the data. So zonal allocation errors usually arise in part from the accuracy with which mobile network operators can allocate events using a cell mass geography, and partly from data processing errors arising from mapping of the cell mass geography to the model zone boundaries, and there are uncertainties there. So it's very important to recognize this and use the data at the spatial level that could be trusted. Other biases relate to underrepresentation of trips that making short stops at destinations because they have lower dwell times to be categorized as trips. Under detection of short trips, which is a common limitation of mobile phone data, and also uncertainties and under detection of trips made by international visitor is a common issue in the data. So basically, this slide shows a suggested processing steps when mobile network data is used to develop demand matrices, basic demand matrices. The very first step is, as I mentioned, is to understand the spatial accuracy of the data and whether there's a need for aggregation so that the data is used at a level that can be relied on. Once the spatial accuracy of the data is verified, then there are a number of processes that needs to be undertaken to basically correct various aggregate trip biases in the data, to identify and remove modes and vehicle types that could not be inferred easily from the data. Then we need to review and correct for missing short trips. We need to usually segment the data into more detailed trip purposes, which are usually required by transport models. There is usually a need for a process to disaggregate the data spatially to a more detailed zoning system, and also processes are required to merge and refine the matrices to reduce various errors. And in principle, these are all undertaken through a data fusion process where we actually make use of various strengths and insights from other complementary data sources. And what's important is that there should be an ongoing verification process attached to all of these steps, because it's likely that following certain matrix development steps, there may be issues and biases remaining in the data that need to still be corrected. So it's important that this process is basically ongoing. Right, so I'm just going to mention a few principles that should be followed during the data fusion, and that is basically irrespective of data type. These principles could actually be applied to any data, all sorts of data sources which are being merged together. So the first of these is that we should always make sure that data sources are unbiased as far as possible, and also they are consistent both in terms of definitions and estimates of trips before they could be merged together. So they need to be consistent and unbiased. When we merge different data sources together, it's very important that we consider the relative accuracy of the data sources which are being merged, and give more weight to the data sources where we judge them to be more reliable, or there's evidence showing that they're more reliable. And we also need to give careful consideration to the types of errors in each data sources. So, for example, some of the errors in some of the data sources could be size related. So when we aggregate the data, the errors are reduced. Therefore, consideration needs to be given to at what level we should merge the data. And also, when we validate the results, it's important that we we use standards that basically respect the errors in the data sources which are being compared. That's quite important. We need to recognize the error around the two estimates where we are comparing data or estimates together. Right, so yeah, as I mentioned, there is along with all various processing steps, there is a need for ongoing verification. And that's mainly because it's likely that following certain metrics development steps, there may be biases in the emerging metrics or inconsistencies between different data sources. Therefore, there's a key step in metrics development process, and that is iterative checking and refinements of assumptions and processes. And these may be accompanied by evidence-based and justifiable adjustments to improve the matrices. So verification tests basically should be undertaken in order to both identify errors and biases and also verify that these have been addressed sufficiently. And in principle, this is mainly achieved by comparing various aspects of demand matrices with other complementary data sets, considering the statistical properties of the estimates which are being compared. So this table shows, summarizes key measures of demand that should be verified from the matrices, and also and various data sources that could be used for benchmarking. So we need to, it is all aspects of the matrices that needs to be taken into account and verified, and these include in principle, number of trips in the matrices. We can look at things like trip rates and trip ends for this. We need to look at pattern of trips as well in the matrices. We could use measures such as triplet distributions or look at distribution of trips or the trip ends. We need to verify the accuracy and completeness of demand segmentation in the matrices, and that includes mode shares, purpose splits, and time period splits in the matrices. We need to verify that the matrices are symmetric as expected. We need to make sure that the directionality of trips are sensible, and also, and at the end, of course, we need to ensure that the model demand from the matrices are consistent with other data sources, in this case with traffic counts on the network. So it's important to consider overall the shape of the metrics when we verify the matrices. And we need to use various data sources for comparison, as I mentioned. And okay, finally, I'll just like to mention some very specific considerations that we need to be careful about when we process the mobile network data. We do need to identify whether expanded MND matrices include residual errors in the allocation of trips to the zones. As I mentioned, MND matrices should be generated at a level at which they are judged to be most reliable, and that's very important. We often need to isolate modes and vehicle types. So for example, Philippe mentioned that there are processes and algorithms to use to infer and to identify motorized, rail, and slow matrices. But if the purpose, for example, is to develop a matrix of car demand, we still need to identify other modes of travel, such as freight and bus, and exclude these from the matrices. And in principle, a probabilistic approach is preferable when trips from each cell in the matrix are allocated to different modes and vehicle types proportionally. This is to reflect differences in both in trip length, in routing, and in the land use. It's important. And also, another quite common requirement is to further segment the matrices that basically are developed from just the processing of mobile data, because they usually lack detailed segmentations that we need. So in order to do that, we need to make sure that the demand segments at each production attraction or origin destination reflect the diversity in the land use, trip rates, and planning data. So if we are segmenting, for example, by different purposes, the purposes should actually have a sensible link to the planning data or land use from that zone. And also, it's equally important to make sure that the segmented matrices reflect the differences in triplet distributions by demand segment, as supported by the evidence provided by complementary data. So, for example, if we are segmenting the matrices by different purposes, say by commuting and business purposes, business purposes, for example, typically are longer than commuting purposes. So when we derive and apply segmentation factors, we need to make sure that we respect these differences in trip length between the two purposes, and these are reflected in the outcome. So these were there are a number of other considerations and detailed processing steps that needs to be considered, and they are, as Neela mentioned, they're set out in the new tag guidance to be released soon. But I just wanted to mention a few key and important principles that should be taken into account. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Reza. I think we move on to the last presentation, last but not least, as always, Louis Williamson. Let's see if those slides come up.
Apparently, I cannot control the movement of the slides. If we go to, my name is Philo Williamson, and I would like to talk about some of the practical applications we have undertaken at Nomon Kineo Mobility Analytics, mostly in Spain, where the company started, although we're now moving into other areas. Can we move to the next one? There are plenty of new data sources that can be used at the moment. We focus on mobile phone data because it's particularly attractive, and they provide door-to-door trips, a very high sample size, and generally they're very representative. But if we continue, there are other data sources as well. Next. I think we are very we have been successful using smart card data from public transport ticketing systems. Of course, this data only covers demand from stop to stop, but it's a very good source of data for public transport, where sometimes mobile phone data is not that good. Two other sources of data look like GPS data, much more accurate than mobile phone data, both spatially and temporally. One of them is the navigation system, the GPS navigation systems, but they obviously only offer you information about vehicle movements. On the other hand, certain apps and apps aggregators, which combine information from several apps, provide GPS location data. This is door-to-door. It's very good. The main problem there is bias. The uses of apps are not uniformly distributed among the population, not even among the population of mobile phone users. And that bias is unknown, so it's much more difficult to expand this type of data than other sources of data. And finally, there is automatic number plate recognition data that sometimes services of that kind are used to get local. Bluetooth and Wi-Fi service are equivalent in a sense. They produce local odimetries rather than door-to-door odimetries. Next. Each one of these data sources provides some elements about mobility. None of them provides a full picture. So combining them with data fusion, while at the same time correcting for errors and biases, is very important. And we think that in that process, a good understanding of how transport modeling is done is very useful. Next. What we would like to have in order to have good model and good forecasting, we would like to have origin destination matrices, either in an OD format or a production attraction format, which in fact it is to be preferred for modeling purposes. Ideally, we would like to have the mode of transport use, including new mobility, micro mobility as well, and active modes. Journey purposes. There is a question about how many journey purposes we need, actually. Sometimes we go overboard with the number of journey purposes when perhaps a small number will be more accurate and better from behavioral perspective. Some personal characteristics, in particular vehicle ownership, is something that we need to know in order to get some good models, split models. The day of travel and the time of travel, and more recently, because we can have this information from mobile phone data, we can identify whether the trip is a recurrent trip, like a commuter trip, or is a non-recurrent trip. And in fact, my personal view is not just a view, it's an observation about what we know about reality, is that the majority of trips are non-recurrent in practice. And this poses an interesting conundrum for modeling purposes. We would like to have flows. Usually we employ traffic counts for that purpose, classified traffic counts. We need to have travel times or speeds in order to calibrate our models. Ideally, we would like to have from reality the preferences of users, in particular the value of time or generalized cost weights to waiting time, etc. And because, again, mobile phone data can provide you this, we now have the opportunity to look at presence. For example, we have done in Spain an interesting piece of work about exposure to pollution, air pollution and noise pollution. And this is much better done with where you actually are rather than when you live, because when you live, you're only exposed to this for a fraction of the time. Next. Data fusion. This is a strong view in our case. Data fusion works better when you work with raw data. Working with aggregate data makes it much more difficult. Working with raw data is much easier to combine, for example, smart car data with movements, individual movements in a mobile phone domain. I would like to show you some examples of the work we have done. As I said, all of this in Spain, although we are starting to work in other areas. Vehicle classification is a problem with mobile data. We can use two sources to improve on that. One of them is data fusion, frequent visit to logistics centers, for example, or classified traffic counts can help you identify different type of vehicles, but also the time, the behavior over time of traveling. And on the right, you have a picture that shows how heavy vehicles move longer distances and in a different pattern compared with light vehicles. So we can identify what is heavy commercial vehicle by looking at the pattern of movement, not just on one day, over a week. In general, at Kineo, we tend to use data for a month in order to provide good representation of travel behavior in a particular area. We have done some work with toll roads, which is are not very popular in the UK, but they exist a lot in Spain and in Australia. In this particular example I'm showing here is for a client that operates a toll road. We use data from the toll plazas to adjust the model, the matrices that were coming from the mobile phone data. But the purpose of this work was to identify potential demand, which was not used in the toll plazas, which could be attracted by a slightly different pricing structure. And we were able to provide these and help them calibrate a vision model in order to consider different pricing structure levels and see how much demand would be attracted. On the right, we have some graphs showing variations in demand over different conditions. A very large study of interurban mobility in Spain. This was done for the equivalent of the Ministry for Transport, Ministerio de Fomento in Spain. This was a survey that they perform annually with using manual methods, and they wanted to check whether this could be replaced with mobile phone data and other data. This is a case of very strong data fusion. The objective was to obtain origin destination matrices, not just trips, but also legs and tours for residents and non-residents. So tourists are an important component of traffic in Spain. The mode of transport, private cars, buses, rail, air, maritime movements. The islands are included in this survey as well. Route choice for road trips, and the periods of summer and autumn, in July, August, and October. And the data sources we used was mobile phone data from Orange operator, land use from a depository of land users in Spain, population from the census for expansion, that's what we normally use for expansion, tourist information, which was used to expand roamers. There's always a problem with expanding the number of roamers in the system because we don't know where they sleep, and to relate them to population, it will not be appropriate. The transport network, we obtained this from the ministry and also from APIs for transport plan, travel planners, and other ticketing data as well. And here in this slide, we can show how the pattern of trips changes a little bit between, for example, a Friday in July. These are trips which are longer than 50 kilometers. The trips pattern on an average Thursday in October or a Sunday in October. And these are trip patterns which are slightly different. And in this one, I'm showing you the difference of mode choice mode split that we identify for different days of the week and different periods of the year. In the next slide, I'm showing an example of a simpler, perhaps, fusion of mobile phone data with smart card data. The smart card data used in Malaga, and that combination was used to develop and calibrate the Malaga transport model that is now being used for strategic planning purposes. This is an illustration of the trip materials for all trips and for public transport trips. And in this study for Barcelona, this is the Barcelona ring roads, there was consideration of whether pricing should be applied to the entries and exits of Barcelona in order to manage congestion. And in this case, we perform a fusion of mobile phone data with the public transport service and ticketing data, some GPS data in order to get travel times, traffic counts for calibration and validation purposes. And there was the sprinkling of roadside interviews that we actually had more difficulty in incorporating into the model. The model that was developed for this, not just by ourselves, but part of the team, was an activity-based model using MapSim. And there is a reference there where you can find an article published in the technical press. And finally, I would like to say a few things about the challenges of modeling that we're facing now with mobility as a service and autonomous vehicles. Mobility as a service is a new mode, which is more similar to taxi than anything else that we are doing at the moment. But different from taxi, it can also be used for ride sharing. And therefore, more than one origin and destination is served by the same vehicle, but is not doing that on a fixed route. This poses additional modeling challenges because in principle, you will have to model the logistic and dispatcher system. How do you schedule these services in order to serve the request of individual users that would like to travel from A to B? This becomes very natural for agent-based microsimulation, type of microsimulation I just mentioned. We collaborated in the Barcelona case. But this requires that you identify the time, the exact origin, and the exact destination of the person that wants to travel and his preferences, whether he's willing to share a ride with somebody else or is very keen to use a single ride like a taxi. You need to introduce service constraints in order to understand this. What is the maximum waiting time that you're willing to wait for one of these services and then prefer to go by your own car or by public transport? And the tour length, because when you are ride sharing, you are not going in the shortest route between origin and destination. You have to pick up and deliver other passengers on the way, and that's a detour that lengthens your travel time. We did an example of that again in Barcelona, which is very keen to this type of case. And we helped to develop with the PDV group a hybrid model, which is part aggregate. The demand model is aggregate, but the supply model is disaggregated, is agent-based microsimulation. Origin destination data from mobile phone data, together with the other data sources I've already mentioned for Barcelona, were used to estimate trip matrices, and those trip matrices were then put through a multimodal model, which included mobility as a service, initially with assumed level of service, assumed travel times, assumed costs, assumed waiting time for them. These are assigned, and then in the next step, we create a synthetic population. We expand, or rather, we create a synthetic population starting from the trip matrices from the mobile phone data, and identify every single resident in Barcelona, and assume within the time period in which they were traveling, a particular time in which they want to travel, and the destination they want to travel, and they make a request to use mobility as a service or to travel by conventional modes, car, public transport. And these requests for service are attended by PTV mass modeler, which takes into consideration these requests and allocates, finds an optimal way of serving these customers using the service constraints, the maximum waiting time, the maximum detour time, and allocates these services. And only then you can recalculate the real level of service that is offered by mobility as a service, the real average waiting time or equivalent waiting time for each of these individuals, and feed back this information to the demand model and repeat this process. This was essentially a research project funded mostly by the European community, and the results have now been used to develop other applications and improve the mass modeler of PTV, and also in our case to develop other approaches of using mobile phone data in a refined way to create this synthetic population as well. With this, I've given you a picture of the type of applications that we have undertaken in Spain. Spain has been a very good market for us. We have undertaken something like 60 projects of this kind, some of them simpler, some of them a bit more complex, but it gives you an idea of how this new data source can be used to develop models. At the moment, we are trying to develop models which are very similar to what we have been developing so far with the conventional data sources. The next step will be to find a way of combining better modeling tools with the current new data sources that we have available. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Pilar, for that. And I think that last point is very important, that at the moment we're looking at using big data, including mobile phone data, to support our traditional modeling forms, which were of course developed in a data poor world, and now we're in a data rich world, and what can we do with this data to actually improve our models as well. That is the end of our official presentations. Before we move into questions and answers, I did want to recognize that there are of course already successful projects using mobile phone data in Australia and New Zealand, and although we didn't manage to get local speakers in our program, this morning I was contacted by Norion Ubashel from Mantra Studios, who's done some interesting work with big data in transport planning in Canberra. So we're going to try and give Norion a few minutes to talk us through what he's done if the technology manages to stay up. Clara, can you see if that works?
Okay, I have just unmuted you, Norian. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm assuming it's going through.
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Great, I sent through some slides. I'm not sure if they're available to share. If not, I will just talk.
I have just put them up for you, so just say next slide when you want me to go to the next slide, please.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for having me today on such short notice, and thanks to WSP for inviting us to share some of the work that we've been collaborating with the Australian Capital Territory Government and WSP engineers in Australia on. We're a small data analytics group, mostly focusing on informing urban strategy and place strategy for urban master plans, etc. But we've also been using some of our recent toolkits and work to inform transport planning and modeling as well. And so I thought I just might share a few slides, which are more data design, but they are underpinned by mobile phone data, and we've been using this information to help inform these planning strategies. And this first slide that you're looking at here is a picture of the center of Canberra in the ACT, and we're looking at a section of the city that's a pedestrian-only zone, and it's being highlighted in yellow in this particular graphic. And the red outer lines are devices that we've traced over a 6-month period that have originated from different locations around the site. And the yellow line is actually their destination into the place. And what we were looking to understand were patterns of movement from outside of this area and then into the place itself. And this was really early days. Since then, we've actually been able to develop some interesting tracing methodologies to track pedestrian movements of individual devices through space into this pedestrian-only area. Next slide, thanks. This is another shot from the same study. Parts of it's getting cut off here, my apologies. But what we're also showing here is individual devices layered over time. And we're looking at inside of buildings and in spaces around that, which includes road networks. And what we're able to do is to query these data models to understand patterns of place use and utilization, also place demand over time, such as month-on-month demand, for example. In this case, it's a pedestrian study. So we've excluded devices that were moving at speeds above walking speed, but it allows us to generate a comprehensive picture of an urban place using a big data set that would otherwise not be feasible with a physical count. But as was spoken earlier in the presentation, is really around this need to calibrate data. In some instances, we only see 7 to 10% of devices in an area that we know might be there. So we have to calibrate our data model against real numbers to actually come up with values of people that we might see in a place. But what we can see with statistical information are patterns of place use and place demand. And this is actually quite evident in the graphic in front of us. We're looking inside of a shopping mall, and we can see the pedestrian traffic, at how it moves through the pedestrian areas and then spills out into the public space. Next slide. This is a different data model. We're helping Google and a property developer in downtown San Jose better understand activity epicenters at a precinct scale as they move parts of their campus from Mountain View down to downtown San Jose. And what we were doing here was to not only understand the activity epicenters within the city in terms of inside of buildings, but also in terms of public open space, and then using different techniques to almost quarantine the devices that we see within a geofenced area, and then see where they go at certain points in time to inform a retail offer or food and beverage offer within their campus planning. So we can see the types of people that are spilling out of buildings at different intervals and where they actually head to. So, but this is, I mean, this is all mobile data that's being displayed over time. So we're seeing trend data here where a device is actually stacking up to create that extrusion. Next slide, thanks. This is a different study in Canberra again, in collaboration with WSP, and what we were looking to understand was the impact of the ACT government opening their light rail station in a small town center. And so we ran our tools for 6 months to understand patterns of place use and utilization, and we can see sort of clustering activity centers outside of a building and where movement has occurred, connecting back into the town center zone. And sitting behind that is, of course, all of the statistics that allows us to track change over time and see patterns of place use emerging using mobile device data. Next slide, thanks. This is a visualization as an arc map, which is taking devices that were seen within the light rail station in the town center that we were studying, and then where we'd actually seen those devices sleeping at night. And this is a small sample set that's being displayed in this visualization, but we start to be able to see patterns of, you know, density of devices that are occurring within, you know, 1 to 5 kilometers, and from 5 to 10 and 10 to 20, and then we can use some of that information to, you know, inform strategies around marketing, for example, to certain audiences to use the light rail service, or just to better understand how people are using the town center at large. Next slide. Or is that the last one?
That's the final slide.
I think that was the last slide. So,
yeah.
Thank you,
I'll
Nora.
leave it there. I just wanted to share a couple of visualizations that we're working on.
Thanks, Nora. And for me, again, what I take away from that particular presentation is it's not just about modeling, it's very much about insights. And what I find quite exciting is that this kind of data should give us much better information to start feeding into before and after studies, measuring the success, monitoring the success of interventions. Right, we are going to move to questions and answers. I hope that is going to work. So Dave is my assistant, so Dave Killian is my assistant, so he's giving me some questions that the audience has asked, and I will ask individual presenters perhaps to respond to them relatively quickly. We are a little bit behind. So first question is, how do you distinguish between a car driver and a car passenger? For example, how would you distinguish between one driver with 2 devices or a car that has got 2 people in with 1 device? Can I ask Reza perhaps to tackle that one?
Yeah, sure, I can. I mean, I speak for Philip here that cannot be recognized through processing of mobile phone data, so event data. So that needs to be dealt with later on through data fusion process. So we don't recognize we cannot recognize drivers and passengers from each other. So what we normally do is to process mobile phone data as metrics of people and people's movement, and then later on use information and insight from other data sources to convert them to vehicles, so to split between vehicle and people at a fairly more aggregate level than the individual level. So that's one of the limitations of mobile data. In terms of people having 2 devices, so the question is whether the 2 devices would be from the same network or not. If they're not from the same network, so that's not an issue, because so that there won't be any double counting in the sample. But if they are from the same network, that's one of the reasons that we may have some biases in the data That's one of the errors associated with expansion, and so that needs to be dealt with later on through the verification and fusion steps. So does that answer the question? Philip may want to add something to this, I suspect. I don't know.
Okay, I'm going to. I think that's very well covered, yeah, it is the reality. I want to pick another question that is asked, and it is it possible, likely, or common that one would aggregate the mobile network data to a level that is considered acceptable, but then disaggregate it using other data sources? So what is the best way in which to sort of, to as it were, protect the integrity of the data?
Yeah,
maybe.
Can I take that, Tom? So that was part of the presentation. Yeah. So yes, exactly. So the level that we process the mobile data is usually, and we trust mobile data in terms of allocations to zones, is usually more aggregate than the level that we eventually need the matrices in. So we need to go through the process of disaggregation. And yes, it's very important that we just retain the link with land use information, but also what's important is that we reflect the distribution of trips within the aggregate zones that are going to be disaggregated. So the preferred approach to this is use a more disaggregate metrics, usually, well, possibly a synthetic metrics or metrics from another source of data that actually is available in the more disaggregate level that we need the data in, and use that to disaggregate the mobile data. So you would have in the resulting metrics, you would you would control the distribution to that observed from the mobile data, but use information from other matrices to disaggregate, respecting, retaining the link with land use, and also reflecting the distribution within the mobile data sectors that are disaggregated to the zones.
Yep, great. I'm going to ask a question that Gianna van Jaarsveld asked. I think she wins the prize of asking the most questions, and that is, what software does TfL use to process 15 million data entries? Do you write your own software? Probably one for you, Tim.
So yeah, so obviously the processing of the mobile network data provided by Telefonica was done on cloud-based systems, so it wasn't done on sort of any transport modeling software that we would typically use. Obviously, TfL themselves, once we get into analyzing data, etc., we would use more standard software packages like R to analyze and interrogate the data sets against other secondary data sources. But for the sheer processing of the huge volumes of mobile network data, that would be by one of your cloud-based computing, either a sort of an Amazon, Google type system. Claire, the TfL system itself that you use for your ODX data is something similar to that. It's the Microsoft version, isn't it?
Yeah, like on Azure.
On Azure, that's the one. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you. A question from where are you? Lindsay Oxlade. How useful are traffic counts as a validation data source, given their limitations in terms of accuracy? Who can I ask that question of? Maybe, Pilo, why don't I ask you that question? You may be muted. Pilo, I don't hear you. Have you left? Okay. What about you, Reza?
Yeah, if you don't mind, can you just repeat the question? That was about the accuracy of count data?
How useful are traffic counts as a validation data source, given the limitations in their accuracy?
Well, exactly. They are a very valuable source of data. Yes, acknowledging that they will have errors attached to them, but that's an error that could be quantified and could be controlled. So just using sufficient sample size will allow us to have limited or acceptable range of errors, which could be quantified through statistical methods. And then when we validate our data or mobile data using count data, we need to respect that interval where the data that reflects the accuracy of the count data, and interpret the validation taking into account the quantified basically sampling, the quantified error around the estimate that we get from the traffic counts. So it's a valuable data source. It is not fully accurate. It has sampling error, but one that we can control and quantify and use in the interpretation.
I would just add to that, Reza, as well. From our experience together, we would be saying that you would need to be using count data collected along screen lines and cordons at the very least. We wouldn't be looking to compare mobile network data across one or two individual count sites to see the accuracy of the mobile network data, because the resolution of the data just won't support it. And we'll also need to account for the fact that the network data where you're collecting your counts may not necessarily match up with the network data of the mobile network data. So if you're within the middle of a network zone, a masked zone, then it can be very challenging, because they could be either sampled one side or other side of that count data by random chance. So it's things you need to consider when you're building this up.
Yeah, the aggregation is an important point that I should have mentioned. Yeah, thanks, Tim.
Right, thank you. A question maybe for Neela or Claire from Daniel Suter. What area size do you consider too small for this type of data set in terms of using the data for the end user case as we're in a model? Is it 10 kilometers, 50 kilometers, 1 kilometer? Some ideas about when you would start feeling as an end user that the data is starting to sort of lose its resolution and relevance.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So so this is in relation, I suppose, to the end aggregation point of the zones that we're trying to fit the data to, or the size of a city or area that we want to explore. I suppose we can kind of tackle it from both sides.
Yes, I think the question was very much about the study area rather than the zone size.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, so we are analyzing the data that we've received, both in the kind of additional analysis outputs we got from the project, but also the base matrices. We will be looking at those at kind of London borough, sub-borough level as well. So, I mean, it's difficult for me to answer really, because we kind of started off at the London level, but we are then scrutinizing at lower levels. I mean, obviously, your data and understanding its shortcomings based on the mobile network data, you have the density of your mass network, but then the issues associated with your kind of data you fused will probably determine that on a local basis. So would be prepared to go quite granular and quite a small level, say within the central area of the city, but we would be more wary about going too small within the outer area, for example. So I think it's just about knowing your geography and how the data works at that spatial level.
I presume there's also discussion to be had, as Tim referred to in his final slides, around using more spatially detailed GPS data and other sources to support that.
Yes, exactly.
In general terms, this is Louis. In general terms, we have found that there are no particular constraints. Every natural model that can be developed or may wish to be developed can be supported by mobile phone data and other data sources.
Thank you. Okay, Another question, as I said, from Gianna, our champion questionnaire. If we still need to carry out household travel surveys and verify mobile phone data against them, what is the point of incurring the cost of obtaining mobile phone data? Anybody who would like to take that on?
I will be happy to take that on.
Good.
This is Williamson again. I think the point is that mobile phone data cannot provide you everything, and therefore there is an advantage in using a household survey. However, the sample size of the household survey can be much reduced. You don't need to have the same 1 or 2% household survey in order to provide the rich behavioral content that the mobile phone data is lacking. So you can probably reduce it to, I don't know, 2,000, 3,000 households. You don't need more than that. Therefore, the cost of the household survey will be smaller. And perhaps some of the questions can also be omitted in the future as well.
Great, good answer. Liz Amt asked, let me just see, can mobile phone data be used to measure intra-household travel and the number of people in the group traveling together? That's an interesting one from that perspective of can we improve our models? Maybe
the short answer is no.
No. Can you explain that a little bit further, Philo?
We cannot see with mobile phone data even at a very even if every member of the household is on the same network, which is not necessarily a condition that will be met. We cannot see whether they're traveling together or not. It's the same problem that was mentioned with the car driver and the car passenger. We cannot distinguish one from the other. We can see that some of the trip patterns in a zone, not in a household, because the granularity, the spatial granularity of mobile phone data doesn't enable you to identify an address, only an area, only a zone. You cannot see whether it's a family traveling together or people traveling together. No, it cannot be done.
I think there's two further points on that may sort of help. In that one is with contracts themselves, and that's typically what tends to happen is that the head of household may have a contract or sign contracts for multiple members within a household, so it'd be difficult to understand whose phone contract is who's within that as a user. And secondly, it was raised by Claire, but obviously the privacy issues associated with mobile network data and other sorts of data vary globally. But obviously within the sort of the APAC region in Australia, it is not possible to view or monitor people under a certain age, and I believe that's 18. So it's any trip that appears like it is a user that is under a certain age must be discounted. So you're instantly discounting quite a few members of most households, and would only be tracking sort of the adults within those households. So that's sort of two further points on that.
Great, thank you. Folks, I'm only looking at questions. I'm not looking at the time. Somebody needs to send me a personal message if I need to wrap up. Claire Thompson, we have been finding that the mobile phone data we've received has more short trips than our household data, which appears to differ from some of today's presenters. Would this differ by the city in question? Would there are there thoughts about this? I mean, I think this is an interesting question in that what is the ground truth, and then whether self-reported household travel surveys are actually more reliable than true observations by mobile phones that have obviously been carried around making these trips. Any views on that from any of the presenters?
Yeah, Philip here from CityLogic. Yeah, I think this one is a very interesting question. From a technical perspective, because of the sizes of the cells, we shouldn't, with mobile phone data, be able to see very short trips. And I think this is simply a function of the technology. However, where it starts to be very interesting in where this data starts to be compared with household surveys. And it's possibly because of the way household surveys are answered that maybe the very short trips are not represented within household surveys. And I think this is an element that was discussed before, which is that with mobile phone data, there is no intervention by the user or no questions being asked of the user. And that means that what we see is really what has happened. Whilst with household surveys, maybe interviewees may actually not give information on a very short trip because they don't see that as important. And this is where the balance between technology on one side with mobile phone data on asking questions through household surveys is ready to be understood.
This is Pilo. I would like to add something. I mean, this is one of the elements of processing mobile phone data is to clean the data, and in particular, in occasions, it may be that some apparent trips are not real trips at all. This is because when you're talking and you're connected to a particular antenna, a particular cell, that cell may be overloaded, and the operator, the mobile phone operator, will switch you to another cell, the connection to another cell, even if you're not moving at all. That's a pseudo movement. It's not a real movement. It's just part of the operations of the mobile phone network that you're being shifted from one antenna to another one in order to cope with demand for calls. One of the processes is to filter those, eliminate them, because they are not real trips. So I don't know whether the data this person has received has a proper cleaning in that sense or not. But Philippe is quite right. Very short trips, we should not have them. We cannot have them for technical reasons. We can have medium distance of 500, 1 kilometer long. And that's when the trips are starting to become real. But shorter than that, we should not be able to tell them.
Thank you, Philippe and Pilo. Those were actually some very important final points to make about that we need to use this data with an understanding of how they are generated, and that's why I was pleased to have Philippe obviously in this presentation as well, and know which questions we need to ask the mobile operators. I think this was really also one of the objectives of this session in terms of saying how can we here in Australia and New Zealand benefit from all those insights that have been generated, so that we can make sure that we ask the right questions and that we get data that's going to be credible, reliable, and useful. I need to wrap up, so we still got a lot of questions to deal with, but we will capture those and we will send all participants a link to the discussion site that we will set up, and hopefully the discussion will continue afterwards. I want to thank everybody who made this webinar into a success, the speakers who got out of bed early, and the participants who stayed up late. Dave Keenan as the main driver behind this initiative. Dave, we spoke about it for quite a long time, and I think we've seen something quite exciting come to fruition here. And finally, Juliana and Daniel from Landor and Clara from Virtual Junction, who got the technology to work. This is one of the first of these kind of events that I have actively participated in, and although maybe it wasn't flawless, it was pretty good. So this is not the end, but the beginning of an online discussion. And Landor will send you the link together with the slides and the recordings of today. So from me, it's a good night to my colleagues in Australia and New Zealand, and to colleagues in the UK, wishing you a productive rest of the day, and once again thanking AITPM and NZMUX for sponsoring this event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, and goodbye.
Thanks, bye.